Welcome, Miles. It's nice to speak with you. I'm speaking with Miles Pomper, who is a senior fellow in the Washington, D.C. office of the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. That's a long mouthful, but everyone in the nonproliferation world knows the Center for Nonproliferation Studies and you. You are a long-time expert in the field after doing some other things in journalism in the State Department, so I'm really pleased you could join me here today. So I wanted to ask you first about your work as chairman of the Fissile Material Working Group. These entire set of interviews are about fissile material, and so I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the FMWG. Can you describe it and what it's doing right now?
Sure. Well, I mean, the FMWG started, I guess now, about 9 years ago. And the idea was when the Nuclear Security Summit process was launched by President Obama to have kind of an NGO counterpart, bringing together all the experts and groups working in the field to take advantage of that opportunity to move forward in a lot of nuclear security issues that to some extent had languished in the previous period and needed a push from civil society. And 9 years later, we're still going strong, bringing together 80 groups and individuals from around the world to push on nuclear and radiological security.
So what still needs to be done? What are the
awful
hottest topics?
Well, I think one of the issues that really wasn't touched by the summit process was the growing stocks of plutonium. Over the last 20 years, the stocks of plutonium have more than doubled.
Are you talking
civil plutonium?
Civil, while the military stocks, mostly in Russia and the United States, have remained at high levels, but haven't grown.
No one's sort of making any plutonium purely for military sphere among the major powers. I mean, you have
Not
Pakistan,
true. India, Pakistan.
Right, but among the
North
P5,
Korea.
you don't have that question. But the civil plutonium in places like Japan and France and other places has grown substantially over the last 20 years.
What can we do about that?
Well, I mean, I think as they say, you find yourself in a hole, you first stop digging, and I think the first thing we need to do is to stop the increase in plutonium, try to cap what we have, places where it's clearly not going to be used anytime soon, to try to draw down those stocks, and then try to prevent new countries from starting reprocessing programs like South Korea, as well as trying to work internationally in the long term to try to get a handle on the problem.
So one of the challenges is that when we look at civil plutonium, you're talking about countries and their nuclear fuel cycles.
Right.
They believe strongly that there should be no restrictions, right? They should be able to either, if they're not, to be clear, not many countries reprocess plutonium.
Sure.
So, for example, the United Arab Emirates, it will probably dispose of its fuel. We're not quite sure. They're just building their first reactor now. But they might also send it to France for reprocessing in the future. It's kind of complicated. I mean, I don't think eventually that the UAE would want to take back plutonium and use it as a fuel in the future, but countries nonetheless don't want their, what they see as their rights restricted in any way. So how do you get them to stop? I mean, what are the real mechanisms to keep those stockpiles from growing? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, I think you have to kind of look at the politics of each country and figure out where the drivers are and where the levers are. I mean, the fact is that economically, there's no economic case for reprocessing right now. There's really no reason practically for them to do so. So what you're really talking about is certain interest groups, lobbies within the country, the nuclear establishments who may want that for their own reasons, but it's not in their national interest. It's not in the, most people, if they kind of knew the situation and were aware of it in that country, wouldn't want to do this. So it's trying to get past the kind of control that the nuclear establishment tends to exert in most countries, because most people don't know these issues, they aren't particularly informed about them, and they also feel ignorant compared to nuclear scientists and others in combating them. So how do you get policymakers and others who have power to realize that this is not a good idea and get past these people who are kind of feeding them the wrong information?
So we've heard from some of the other people I've interviewed.
Right.
We had a Rosatom expert, and then also Tatsu Suzuki from Japan. They talked about different issues. So the Rosatom official was talking about how wonderful plutonium is, and it's the source of the future. It's his perspective.
Sure.
And I would say that the technical community looks at plutonium and a potentially infinite source of energy as a fantastic thing.
Right.
The reality seems to be quite different, and there are always costs entailed. Tatsu Suzuki was talking about how Japanese law forces the industry to reprocess.
Right.
And that creates a technical barrier, and then you just mentioned the cost barrier. So it's complicated, and part of the reason is also publics don't tend to focus on nuclear issues, and when they do, it's mostly in the context of being afraid of radiation. So it's a tough issue to bring kind of rational discourse to. And
very much so.
One of the objectives of this series of interviews is really to make this understandable. But you've also personally done a lot of work on highly enriched uranium minimization and elimination. What's the good news there?
Well, the good news is at least that's an area where we've made a lot of progress in the last 20, 30 years, especially the last 10 with the summit process and so on. We used to have about 50 countries with weapons material, most of which was HEU, and now we've got something like a little less than 24. So a lot of the...
It's about half, right? Yeah.
A lot of countries that used to have HEU, including whole regions, all of Latin America, all of Eastern and Central Europe and Southeast Asia no longer have highly enriched uranium.
So that has removed a potential
threat
target, that terrorists, or potential material that terrorists might target.
Right.
So you're halfway there.
Right. And now we're kind of getting down to the harder cases, unfortunately. This is it's getting to be more of a technical problem than a political problem. And there's both elements of it, but you've got a lot of high performance reactors that, for technical reasons, it's harder to replace the highly enriched uranium with low enriched uranium until you create more dense, low enriched uranium fuel.
So our Russian colleagues suggested there are some reactors that you could never accomplish that, like the reactor at Oak Ridge, and I think there's one in Dmitrovgrad. I don't know if you know the specifics of those, but as a political scientist, I can't judge kind of the technical performances, but often it's a question of cost or,
well, certainly the National Academy of Sciences, who have the technical knowledge to make these kind of judgments, is confident that eventually those reactors could be converted. At least, I don't know about the Russian reactor, but certainly
the issue is the high neutron flux.
Right. That's the issue in all these reactors, is that you have a high neutron flux, and trying to get that, you really need to have, basically because high enriched uranium has more U-235 by definition. You basically have to cram more uranium into the fuel somehow.
Right.
And so how dense you can make it is the question. But the things that they're unveiling now are getting to that point. But it has to be qualified, it has to be tested, it has to be put into particular fuel shapes. And by the time that whole process is done, it'll probably be 10 to 15 years from now. At which point the question is, do you really want to bother converting a reactor, or should you just build a whole new one? Because you're just making a lot of work for it, and those reactors will then be quite old and other characteristics.
So these are kind of classic public policy choices. Right. Yeah. So one last question. Nuclear, what's the nuclear security issue that keeps you up at night?
Probably, I mean, I'd say radiological sources more than the nuclear sources, just because they're everywhere. Every country in the world pretty much has some high-risk radioactive sources, and a lot of countries with very poor security, and in places, hospitals, universities, others, that are very accessible. I mean, the question I always ask myself is not, will there be an attack, is why there hasn't been an attack, because that material is so available around the world.
Right. So this is not to make a nuclear weapon, but to make a radioactive dispersal device, basically a nasty radioactive bomb. So we're not talking Armageddon, but
what they call weapons of mass disruption.
Disruption,
rather
right.
than destruction.
But the fact of the matter is that terrorists pretty much look for targets of opportunity.
Right.
They'll do what they can do if it's not very detectable, and so that's why we need to continue working on reducing that risk. So thank you so much
Thanks,
for your
Sharon.
time.